It's such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for coming out for this conversation about which I care a great deal. And how many of you in the audience are setting foot here for the first time? Fantastic, fantastic. Well, welcome. I'll tell you just very briefly, the Jung Center has been in this neighborhood in existence as a 501c3, as a nonprofit since 1958. And on this spot since 1975. And we offer in a given year more than 200 educational programs that are directly connected to the importance of finding meaning in one's life, connecting the meaning, finding meaning. We have a particular emphasis on psychology. Of course, you may know Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, and if you wanted to come here and study depth psychology, Jungian psychology, of course you can do that, but you can also hear fantastic speakers from all the local universities, many psychotherapists, scholars, writers, artists. We actually have a writing class going on next door right now, as I say, more than 200 in a year that happen here, and then many other things that happen off-site. So if you're just encountering us for the first time, welcome, and we hope you come back. This collaboration with Rice's Religion and Public Life program is really personally meaningful for me. I was very fortunate to be a part of a friends group for the program and for a couple of years, and the work that the Religion and Public Life program is doing in the city of Houston is so important. And so pathbreaking, and will be so useful for this community in the decades to come. It is a great honor to welcome Elena Eklund, who's the director of that program, professor of sociology at Rice University, to come up here. She's going to be moderating tonight, so welcome.
That really warm introduction. I was going to thank Sean for his service to the Religion and Public Life program and just his continued valued role as a conversation partner. And we are really excited to partner with the Jung Center, which is doing its own pathbreaking work in Houston. I'm a professor of sociology at Rice University, and we're very grateful to partner tonight with the Jung Center to host our conversation on spirituality and public action. So just a brief bit about the Religion and Public Life program. Our vision is to do the best research on religion. So we're in a university setting. We're housed at Rice University. And then to use that research to create common ground among people, and hopefully that they will pick up that research and that common ground and work together for the common good of our city and our nation, and even if we might be so bold, our globe. We accomplish our vision through research and training and outreach, and we have a copy of our materials on the front desk if you want to pick up one of our biannual reports or visit our website, which is rplp.rice.edu. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our three panelists. You've already heard from Sean Fitzpatrick, who is the Executive Director of the Jung Center. He is also a psychotherapist in private practice. His research interests include the intersection of psychology and spirituality, ethics and the imagination, and vicarious trauma. He is a senior fellow of the American Leadership Forum and serves on the board of the Network of Behavioral Health Providers. Lupe Mendez, to my far left, is a writer, educator, and activist. He works with Nuestra Palabra, Latino Writers Having Their Say, and the Brazilian Arts Foundation, and other organizations to promote poetry events, to advocate for literacy, and organize creative writing workshops that are open to the public. He is the founder of Tintero Projects and works with emerging Latinx writers and other writers of color within the Texas Gulf Coast region. Ashley Hammer, seated in the middle, is the Director of Programs and Community Engagement at the Rothko Chapel, where she curates and produces an array of public programming that intersects art, spirituality, and human rights, including symposia, human rights awards, meditations, concerts, and lectures. She previously served as the Director of Public Art at Project Row Houses. Tonight we'll address spirituality's effect on public life and public action. Americans are growing less religious in some ways, but not necessarily less spiritual. From one of our studies called the Religious Understandings of Science study, which included a national survey, 33% responded that the label spiritual describes them well. The survey also asked to what extent you're a religious person, and 20% said not at all. So the people that fall into both of these groups would be the spiritual, but not religious. For brevity's sake, they're sometimes called SBNRs. But we also need to be cautious about this category because it can be really sensitive to the way that questions were asked. The Pew Research Center asked the question a slightly different way, and they came up with about 27% SPNRs in the U.S. population, a figure that they said rose significantly from 2012. In general, when looking across surveys, we find that SBNRs tend to be younger, more educated, less likely to be located in the southern United States, and more likely to be women. According to Pew, Generation X and baby boomers have the largest share of SBNRs at 33 and 31%. Among the silent generation, this figure drops off sharply to only 5%. In terms of racial and ethnic status, they look very similar to the population at large. About 28% are whites, 26% are blacks, 23% of Hispanics are SBNRs. So about 65% of the white, 65% of the white population, 11% black and 14% Hispanic. Unsurprisingly, SBNRs are more politically liberal and less religious, attending services less and less likely to believe in God. They're much more likely to say that they do not believe in a personal God, but do believe in a higher power. In terms of morality, SBNRs see the world very situationally. Only 21% say that there are clear standards for what is right and wrong, while 78% say right and wrong depends on the situation. This group is sometimes stereotyped, I think, as being a group of people who are primarily about individualization and self-actualization. And so that's why I think the topic of tonight's conversation is particularly important, to try to find out and imagine together the extent to which this growing population is interested or could even be spurred towards collective action or lead collective action and social justice efforts. Let me just say a few words about tonight's flow. So first, each of our panelists has prepared some remarks reflecting from their different perspectives on this topic. And then I have some questions for them prepared, and then hopefully you'll be thinking of questions as well, and we can open it up for a little bit of dialogue. So please be thinking about your questions. Okay, great. Now I think first is Sean, right?
Yes.
I want to take notes. I want to take notes on what Sean is saying, so.
God help you, here we go.
No pressure.
So I thought as a way of starting that I would focus on some ideas, talking about the idea of spirituality, the idea of religion to a certain extent, and the idea of being spiritual but not religious, and then what connections these might have to public actions, where you're going to talk about spirituality and public action. I do have notes on my lap for a reason, so that I don't go trailing off into the great beyond. So forgive me as I do this a little bit to make sure I'm with you and grounded. So let's start with spirituality, and spirituality, from my very short way of talking about spirituality, is to say that it is a word that means very different things to different people in different contexts. It is a word that is, in many respects, new. And I want to reflect a little bit on that, and it's changing. The understanding of what spirituality means, I think, is changing. So spirituality comes from a Latin root, it comes from spiritus. And this word appears for the first time, it's very much in a Christian context. So it appears in the writings of Paul in the Bible. And spiritus is literally translated as breath. And the Greek word that's associated with pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, also is associated with breath. You might think our English words respiration, right? It's spiritus is at the middle of that, and pneumonia is pneuma is the beginning of that. So, so this gives us a specific image to sort of hang on to as we get started, which is of a dynamic process. Something is moving in and out, and it's absolutely essential for human life, right? So it's this dynamic flow in and out. And I'm going to come back to spiritual wool here in a moment, but first I want to shift to the idea of religion. So there's a historian of religion, late historian of religion named Jonathan Z. Smith, who talked about, religion has the word religio has a long history, and I'm not going to bore you with all of that. The way in which it starts to come into the way we use the word now is actually around the colonial period, so it's around the 16th century. And it begins to be used not to describe one's own behavior. So it's used to describe what was seen in other people, particularly for the colonial powers, for the people encountering new world cultures for the first time. It was a way of looking out there and saying, okay, these people, they have religion, and very importantly, their religion is primitive and not as good as what we do. Okay, so religion is, Jonathan Smith would say, is a second order concept. It tends to be something that is referred to as a way of othering. I'm saying, okay, so this is what's going on in this other culture, it's a way of also pointing out difference. It also, in a contemporary way, it usually suggests kind of a universal human activity. So everyone is religious. Keep in mind, this is a Western scholarly idea that is getting applied across cultures. It also suggests kind of a commonality of purpose and motivation between cultures. There are a couple of really good books on that. I'm going to butcher his name, but I would say Tomoko Masuzawa has a wonderful book called The Invention of World Religions, where he talks about how in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Western scholars are starting to create this idea that there are many different religions around the world. And the short sort of example I would say is that Buddhism was not a religion until Western scholars said it was a religion. You went to the indigenous cultures in which Buddhism was practiced, it didn't become an ism per se until Western scholars started studying it and made it that. I think that's important to keep in mind, put these ideas together. So let's move back to spiritual. So again, spiritual, but the idea of the meanings associated with the word spiritual have a varied history. In the 7th century, spiritual was a word that was used to refer to the property of the church, like ecclesiastical holdings. How different is that from your understanding of spirituality that you brought in here? In the 16th and 17th centuries, we start to see a change, and it's directly related to the emergence of another very important word, which is mysticism, okay, in the same era. And if you're interested in this from a scholarly perspective, Michel de Certeau has written on this subject. So de Certeau says, in this era, 4 things start to change. One of them is that we start to understand the divine as being within human beings, as dwelling in some sense within human beings, and also as being underneath all of religion. The second thing that happens is that mysticism, la mystique in French, begins to be understood as an experience one has. This is something that in the notion of experience starts to come about. So this is about an interior happening for an individual. The third thing that happens is that mystics become identified as a social type. So one could be a mystic. And as I said in a talk here last week, Brenda, maybe other people were at, it was an insult to be called a mystic. It was a problem because you were outside of institutional authority. If you're having a direct experience of the divine, you're not within the control of the ecclesiastical authorities or their meaning systems and so on. So it wasn't a good thing to be called a mystic in that era. The fourth thing that happened is that this experience came to be understood as being accessible to examination. You could look at it scientifically. So, and even as recently as 200 years ago, spirituality would have been understood as something akin to piety, our English word piety currently, which is more about adequately fulfilling one's religious obligations as opposed to the ways in which we use it now. So now let's put all these words together, spiritual but, or I'll go this way first, spiritual but not religious. This term comes at the first published appearance of this, at least that we've discovered to date, was in 1926 in a publication called the American Mercury. And it was a Rotary Club president who used this as a way of talking about his organization. He said, we are non-sectarian and spiritual but not religious. And then the engine that drives it into, again, primarily Western culture, American culture, is the 12-step movement. And for those of you who are not, I think many of us are familiar with it, but of course, in the 12-step movement, it involves, first of all, understanding that you're powerless to change your addiction, and then turning yourself over to a higher power, right? The change can only happen through a relationship or an experience, importantly, an experience of a higher power. So there are a lot of different ways we can discuss this, and maybe later in the conversation if you'd like. But this is what drives it into the culture, is the 12-step movement. It's also, I think, interesting to note that in the same era, the word fundamentalism is coined. So you have one part of the culture talking about being spiritual but not religious, and another one talking about the fundamentals of religion, the fundamentals of religion. So let's, and I think another thing that's important to talk about here, so when I think about the way in which spirituality is used today in common conversation, this is not based on research, this is my assumptions, but is that it's used as a way of talking about, of affirming to somebody that you're talking with, that you are concerned with things that have been historically held within a religious tradition. So you're interested in talking about, you're interested in ultimate meaning in some way. And you're also interested in ethical action in the world, right? So you're concerned with the kinds of things that people who call themselves religious are concerned with. You're just not affiliated with an institution, or you have a complicated relationship with the institution. So something else that we need to talk about is, and we're doing it here at the Jung Center, is that in the same period of time, psychology and psychotherapy becomes an important way of talking about human experience, an important way of conceptualizing and understanding ourselves. And psychology and psychotherapeutic language infuses contemporary spiritualities in a range of ways. And if not in very specific ways, none of this terms of psychology are being used, at minimum, the notion that one would look inward, the one that, or to hypothesize or imagine inwardness, right? That we're looking to our own experience and trying to understand it, maybe to end certain kinds of suffering, maybe to achieve potential that is untapped and we want to access. So Elaine was mentioning some of the criticisms of the spiritual, or skepticisms about being spiritual but not religious. And I would say that two of them just kind of affirm what she said. Two of them are that people who are spiritually but not religious, spiritual but not religious, are more moral relativists, which we heard a little bit in the numbers, right? The sense that our ethics are situational and there's no ultimate truth. Another one, which I think is pretty classic, is that it's narcissistic. And there's a text called by Jeremy Corrett and Richard King. It's called Selling Spirituality. It's a very interesting read. It's a polemic. And what Corrett and King say in that book is contemporary spiritualities are aligned with neoliberal capitalism and in ensuring that the existing power structures are maintained. And the way that they do that is by taking your attention off of the world, off of poverty and disenfranchisement, social inequities, racism, and putting it on your navel, right? So if we're all doing this, we're not going to pay attention to what's happening out there, we're not going to change anything, we're just going to let the power structure exist. So there are problems with that position. I think it's a very important critique and a really powerful critique, and it's also more limited than the people who wrote it imagined it to be. Because, and speaking as a psychotherapist, the process of introspection that has been made possible by the psychotherapy, or is a part of psychotherapy, has also been an agent of great social change. And the example that I would give you very quickly is the LGBT civil rights movement, that within a consulting room, which exists out at the edge of social space, one could speak the forbidden desire, right? One could say what one was actually experiencing. And in that process, be felt, first of all, to be able to articulate who you are as a human being, which wasn't allowed prior to that. And secondly, then that was an engine that drove, in 1972, the APA changing homosexuality from being something that was pathological to something that was normal. So it was a real engine of social change, this kind of introspective process. Okay, let me wrap up. I think I said all that. I would say a couple things. One is I've been uneasy about calling myself spiritual but not religious. But I fall into the category, I think. In that I feel like I am outside of religious institutions, so that I was raised Catholic, I'm not a church-going Catholic. Now, I have complicated relationships with the church, and I have complicated relationships with other traditions. I know that many people who attend classes here at the Jung Center remain affiliated with religious traditions. Many of them don't, or never were. Some of them stepped outside of relations with religious traditions for moral reasons. And I would say that that's a part of my story too. I really struggle with the notion of damnation, that people who are not Catholic or Christian were going to be consigned to hell. And also, frankly, it's still very much in the news. In the last month in the Houston Chronicle, the clergy sex abuse scandal within the Catholic Church is a horrific moral failure. And that's one of the reasons why I personally don't feel that I can be within the church. I feel related to it, but outside of it. And I'm going to read a quote to you. I would say that a place like the Jung Center is, well, let's talk about this later. Okay. I want to end on a quote. This is from Zygmunt Bauman, who is a great sociologist and social theorist. And this is from his book, Postmodern Ethics. And it, I think, frames the way that I think people who attend classes here at the Jung Center think about ethics and morality. He says, it is moral anxiety that provides the only substance the moral self could ever have. What makes the moral self is the urge to do, not the knowledge of what it is to be done. The unfulfilled task, not the duty correctly performed. And this is an interior quote from a scholar named Lockstrup, so bear with me. He says, but it all adds up to the fact that a person can never be entirely sure that he has acted in the right manner, unquote. And Bauman continues, he says, indeed, this uncertainty with no exit is precisely the foundation of morality. One recognizes morality by its gnawing sense of unfulfilledness, by its endemic dissatisfaction with itself. The moral self is a self always haunted by the suspicion that it is not moral enough.
Is this working?
Yeah.
I want to start by saying thank you, and expressing my gratitude to the Jung Center and to Sean and Elaine and Haley and to the Religion and Public Life Program for holding this conversation and for including me. And while I want to one day be one of those people, which I think that you're one of those people where the words are just going to flow out of me, I'm not there yet, and so I have words and I'm going to read them all to you. I'll try my best to make eye contact. There might not be a lot. So I come to this conversation through three lenses of experience. First, as someone who has served for 7 years on the Rothko Chapel staff. Second is someone who has spent the last 14 years working within nonprofit, community-based arts organizations with a focus on social justice. And third is an individual who falls into this broader self-identified category of spiritual. I too am not comfortable with the spiritual but not religious, but spiritual, which feels like a larger category. I can sit inside of that. What I'll share with you is in three parts. First, some background on the history of the chapel, the intended purpose of the space and who it serves, where it fits into this conversation of religious, spiritual but not religious, and public action. Second, I'll share what my experiences have been working there and what I've observed at programs and engaging with attendees and presenters. And last, I'll share what I have learned and my perspectives on this subject. When the Rothko Chapel was dedicated and opened in 1971, it was a place for people of all religions and those of none. To quote one of the founders, Dominique de Menil, the Rothko Chapel is oriented toward the sacred, and yet it imposes no traditional religious environment. It offers a place where a common orientation could be found, an orientation toward God, named or unnamed, an orientation toward the highest aspirations of man and the most intimate calls of the conscience. And from its conception, the chapel was not only to be a place for prayer, meditation, and reflection, but also a place to rally around important human rights issues of the day. Outside on the chapel plaza, Barnett Newman's sculpture, The Broken Obelisk, stands as a monument dedicated to the life, the work, and the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dominique talked about the chapel as having two vocations, that of contemplation and action. And from the beginning, the relationship between the sacred, our beliefs, and our responsibility towards human rights were inextricably linked. Since its opening, the chapel has hosted religious services, interfaith gatherings, passages of life, weddings, memorials, and human rights-related programs. The wonderful thing about the opportunity of being here and doing this project is that it's allowed me to reflect on a lot of things that I'm just always inside of and doing. And so I did spend some time really mining the archives and looking at the many programs that we've offered at the chapel over the 50 years and trying to notice what the trends are. And what I've observed is that the first 10 years were filled with religious services and observations representing many different religious traditions: Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. And over time, those religious services became less concentrated, and there was a growth of more public dialogues and discussions on different social issues of the day. And then human rights prizes and colloquia were introduced. I want to insert that always, from the time that the chapel opened, the representation of different religious practices and traditions have been constant, as well as the rallying around human rights issues. I've just noticed that the quantity of those programs has changed over time, and also mostly that there's just been an expansion, a continuum. I've seen quotes where Dominique says, as I opened all of this, and saying that the chapel is a place for people of all religions and those of none. And in preparing this, I was really curious about how she classified that entire group of nuns, which was before the spiritual but not religious nuns that we speak of today, and the community that fit into that category. And the only thing that I came across was this quote where she talked about the chapel as a place of radical hospitality and inclusivity. And she said, today, churches and synagogues are too much like clubs, and we all know that clubs are meant to keep people out. Maybe this is why so many of the young are staying away. They have no use for clubs. They have a thirst for brotherhood, a brotherhood that includes everybody, every race, every creed, and are attuned to what is happening in the world. Their sensitivity has not been blunted. They are aware of the famines and the wars and the torture. They try to do something about it. And my observation is that in the 70s, she was noticing this movement away from organized religion and a drive within this community towards social action. I came to the chapel in 2012 as the Community Engagement Director. I worked with the religious communities and coordinated services, created the Volunteer Guilds program, and then later moved into directing public programs. In 2013, the chapel created an entire series about this very topic, the spiritual but not religious. And I think that was the first time the term really came into my consciousness. And it caused me to take stock of what this term means to me and how I identify. My grandmother was very active in our Presbyterian church, and I would join her every other weekend, holidays, and summers from as early as I can recall. It was a positive experience, it was a good community, but from a young age, I remember noticing contradictions in what was being spoken and taught and how people were moving through the world. And I also noticed a feeling of exclusivity and judgment. I was always spiritually curious. In high school, I started attending a Tibetan Buddhist temple instead of church, and then I stayed adjacent. I don't know if that's the best word, I think so. I stayed adjacent to organized religion in my adult years, still learning, attending different churches and temples here and there, but not identifying with any one community or tradition. I don't know when the word spiritual came into my life, but in my adult years, I found that I was able to identify with and felt most comfortable with this classification, although vague. A year after I started working at the chapel, my 88-year-old grandmother said that she'd like to see me find a nice church in Houston. And I recall saying, well, I have found a church of sorts. Really? I found the Rothko Chapel. It felt like the closest that I had found to a spiritual home. It brought together my core values for community, creativity, spirituality, human rights, and inclusivity. When I came to the chapel, I think there were probably 3 classifications that lived in my head: religious, spiritual, and atheist. And I've learned that, like life, it's much more nuanced, much more expansive, and it's not this or that. It is often this and. There's a spectrum. There are many classifications within each of these labels of religious and spiritual, but not religious. And there's also all the space that's in between. There's a lot going on in the world, in our city, and in the midst of so much ugliness, chaos, and an oversaturation in available contradictory information on the news, people need a place to sit, to be alone, quiet, and to listen for the voice within, to learn, to process, to be in community. And I think the chapel is one of those places that provides a refuge. The chapel now has over 100,000 people that come on a daily basis to sit within the space, to attend services, and for the programs. And the community is very broad and diverse, ranging in nationality, race, gender, age, and beliefs. The similarity that I've observed is that they come with some bit of openness, curiosity, and interest in this place and in the subjects that we're exploring. The heartbeat of the chapel is a core belief that all human beings are created equally and deserve equal human rights. And it is a place that promotes interfaith dialogue, holds space for first-person narratives shared respectfully, and it reveres creativity and the arts as a vessel to connect us to the deepest parts of ourselves and to one another, and to that which is bigger and outside of ourselves. In thinking about some of my contemporaries who are socially active and some of the many presenters I've encountered and spoken with at the chapel who fall into this spiritual classification, what I've observed is that their spirituality is deeply personal. It means something different for each of them, but it's not lacking in rituals, beliefs, and certainly not integrity, morality, or deep desires to serve others and fight for social injustices. It is an overgeneralization to say that people who are religious and have a moral compass and are more grounded and more apt to be socially active than those who are spiritual but not religious. In my own personal life and from my work at the chapel and in other interfaith and human rights groups, I notice that there are many variations, from those who are deeply religious but not socially active to activists who are atheist. The deeper question I keep coming back to is, where does our morality come from? Can it simply be X? I don't think so. I would be much more interested I think a much more interesting question and study is to look into who is socially active and then trace what their beliefs are. And then see what that breakdown is and what that data is telling us. Maybe this work has been done. I didn't research that. I just came to that idea before this for everyone. What I think Mrs. Demonel spoke to, and what I see in many of the interfaith communities that I've been part of during my 7 years being at the Rothko Chapel, is that there is a community of people who believe in our shared humanity, who believe that all human beings should be respected and have equal rights. They range from atheists to humanists to different indigenous traditions to spiritual but not religious, and the list goes on. And they're all committed to coming together with those of different socioeconomic, racial, gender, and religious backgrounds to move the dial and make positive change in the world. This is what I see at the chapel, a calling towards something that is bigger than ourselves, a responsibility to care for others and to work to make the world we live in a more peaceful and equitable place. And while some might worry that we're losing religions, I don't think so. I think that there'll always be a need to preserve tradition, and I think it's possible and necessary to have a space for other practices and ways of seeing to emerge. And I'm not worried about a lack of moral compass and public action in a society that has a growing spiritual but not religious representation. Everything that I've noticed and experienced tells me the opposite. So in closing, I have more words from the very eloquent Mrs. DiMino. All of us who love the chapel tend to see here a place that strips us of the superfluous, of accessory, a place that always brings us to the essential. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
So I have a big teacher voice, so you might not need to hear me with the microphone. I'll be the individual that did not prepare comments for the evening. In looking at terms of, I'm a bit more comfortable than I can say in terms of being spiritual and not, what was the phrase, spiritual but not religious. But not religious. Yeah, I'm good. That's good. I can do that. The idea behind it for me, I think, stems from, because of having 19 years in both public and private school teaching, K through 12, it's always from a very academic, exploratory idea behind what is possible, what has been done, what's observable, and what you can do with it later, right? For my own practices, I always think of the actor, Mexican actor, Gael Garcia Bernal, who said, when asked, "Are you a practicing Catholic?" And he said, he smiles and says, I remember this because it was live on TV, and I looked at my mother and I was like, yes. They asked him, "Are you a practicing Catholic?" To try to catch him on the spot, he smiled and he said, I am of, yo vengo de una cultura católica. Smiles and then moves on down the red carpet. And I was like, oh, a Catholic culture. Whatever the hell that is, I'm gonna have some of that. And it began to stir in my head the concept that to be as a part of the practicing things of both religion and spirituality can be different and the same at times. It's one of those, I grew up as a practicing Catholic. I went to private school as a kid. I went to private school in college. I currently teach at a private school. Having taught for years in a public school setting, but looking in terms of what are the habits that we tend to be comfortable with, both in practicing what makes us better humans, period, right? If I follow what my mother does, and I still do to this day, I pray every morning, and thankfully, to praise the day. What I and who I have prayed to over the years has changed. Being a 21st century 42-year-old Latino male in the city of Houston has broadened my understanding of how both culture and race and gender affects how we view our own religious upbringing. What is the role that we fall into within these set designs, and how do we orchestrate them in a way that we can begin to figure out where the world is for ourselves. As a Latino male in my household, my wife is Dominican, and so we both grew up in a very Catholic culture. Both of our practices of Catholicism, sometimes it's right straight down the line of what a U.S.-based Catholicism looks like. The variations of that change, though, because we are both beset by the very understanding of what colonial Catholicism looks like, and the damages that it's done to our own indigenous populations. And then the translations of what that's done over centuries of time. The practices that my wife has of using Palo Santo to bless a house is very different than my use of sage in a house to bless a house, and holy water, and all those things, right? But then we begin to study it, we look and we question in terms of why is it that we do the things that we do? Where did we get these particular things? Because that's not the same as some of the kids I went to school with. Why is that different? Where did this come from? How did we come about this understanding of what religion looks like? And then you not look only at the religious side, but you look at the practices in a home. I grew up both here in the U.S. and in Maple, traveling along the border, farming with family, going back and deep in Maple to farm with family, coming back stateside to go to school for much of my life until the end of junior high. And we always made a winter trip in Jalisco. So if that's Texas, we're all the way here in Mexico. Further past Mexico City, closer to the western coast, Baja California. Puerto Vallarta is like 4 hours away from where my family's village sits. If that helps anybody. I've never been to Puerto Vallarta, thank you, send a postcard. But we have always made a family trip as long as I can remember, me sitting on the shoulders of any elder, and trekked from our village to San Juan de los Lagos. And there's a replica of the Basilica in San Juan here in San Juan del Valle here in Texas. And it's a beautiful rendition of the same church that exists in my Mexico. And when I look at it, the first time that I went to the one here in Texas and I thought of home, it wasn't the building that caught my attention. It was the fact that I wasn't with the rest of my family making the trek. And for me, it was not the space that made it a religious or spiritual experience. It was the people that I was spending the time with. And then when I look back at my own family history, we weren't doing things that were exactly Catholic. We prayed with a conch shell in the 4 directions of the wind to the and the sun. And those are Aztec practices. And looking at those became some amalgamation of religion and spirituality between what was indigenous and what we had learned or what we were learned to do from whatever colonial periods, and that became what I've known. Does my family still take that trek into San Juan every year? I plan to take my own daughter on that very same trek. Am I more spiritually in tune with the things that we were doing as we were going? Not as a kid. I thought that was standard and normal. I thought everybody took some kind of pilgrimage to go trek to some place. But it did not hit on me until now in my 40s, looking in to see that the very temples that were original, not just Aztec, but Huichol tribes that live in the west coast of Mexico, were originally then demolished and churches built upon the very spaces that were once indigenous. That now we pray and look to something else in the sky is irrelevant for me. What's important is who am I going with when I'm praying? I do remember very clearly, what was, not William Dafoe, why am I saying William Dafoe? What is, it was a Mel Gibson film. It was the Passion of Christ. I took my mother to see it. She didn't understand a lick of it. It was all in subtitles. And my mother cried at the end of the film. It did not faze me in the same way. My mother's understanding of religion and theology is very different than my own. My mother, child of the 1930s, survived the tail end of World War II, was born at the end of the Depression, grew up in South Texas. Her understanding of what religion and theology and spirituality was very different than what mine are. My grandparents in Mexico were born in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. Their understanding of religion and spirituality is very different. Neither of my grandparents, my grandfather who just passed away most recently in September, lived to be 100 years old. Could recite to you every prayer that he knew. Has never read a book in his life. Couldn't read you the Bible if he tried. Could close his eyes and walk you in the direction of La Basílica in San Juan for 80 years. And that, to me, is the understanding of the difference between the theology, the spirituality, and religion. Is he a devout follower of something? Yes. When he would tell me, oh, praise God and the four winds, I picked up on the four winds part and asked why the four winds. It was like, oh, those are the spirits that keep everything about these churches alive. What much more do I need? I don't think there's a lick about any of that in a Bible or the Catechism or any of those things that I learned while even attending the University of St. Thomas. But you can't take away the validity of what that means. That my great-grandmother, before her passing, in my youth, even with dementia, could travel out of her house at the top of the hill, walk herself down. There's a small lit capilla, a small chapel. Chapel isn't even the right word. It's a small, what looks like a telephone booth with a small statue of what's supposed to be La Virgen, but I don't think it's La Virgen. It's not the Virgin Mary. It's an image of a woman, and we've always lit candles inside of it. And every morning at 5 a.m., she goes down when she was alive and would light her candle every morning. I don't know what she prayed, but that she prayed every morning was the important element. So those become the habits that we pick up and that we take on as we explore what is it that fulfills us, what is it that enlightens our way, what is it that allows us to find that equilibrium within ourselves to move forward and to make that day the best, not only for ourselves, but for now the action piece, I think, is the important part. What are we doing to be better for one another within the communities that we prescribe to, right? Those levels are the important part. I give my high school students, now that I teach at a private Catholic high school, 2 quotes. I was looking through my apologies. I was reminded of a quote, like, oh, let me get this quote down. I'm such an anarchist about stuff when I teach the kids. I'm trying not to be. I teach at a Jesuit high school. There's only 2 in the city. Actually, there's 3 in the city, so you can guess, and I'll tell you, I don't know. One of the quotes I teach the kids in terms of how we work with the students, in terms of building their identities to be men and women for others, is to always question from a distance the idea behind what somebody else tells you is good. Does it function for you in the same way? And I speak much to, even though it's a very Catholic idea, San Martin de Porres, who is an Afro-Latino friar of Peruvian descent, who was argued with and yelled at because he brought a homeless, sick guy off the street into where all the other priests were living. And he replies to all his brothers, "Compassion, my dear brothers, is preferable to cleanliness. Reflect that with a little soap I can easily clean my bed covers, but even with a torrent of tears I would never wash away from my soul the stain that my harshness towards the unfortunate would create." I teach to the kids then the idea, faced within the things that we are learning within the theology, to even be able to say that the ideas that sometimes are presented might not be the exact right thing at that moment. What is it that you know is to truth? What is it that you know that is to right? And what is it you know that is to goodness? And that should lead you forward. If the kids can do that on an everyday basis, then they themselves become their own living word in terms of what values, right? I look in terms as well as to what is it that we are spiritually connected to in terms of language. Those of you that read passages from spiritual works, there are particular passages that we read that call to us more than others. My mother has always forced Psalm 23 until I'm blue in the face. I know it in 3 languages. My kids know it in 3 languages. But what is that concept? When we're comfortable with when we say that we're being spiritual, if we are at a point where we're saying that we're not so religious, you still have practices. Those are still the things that you are looking towards in the day, and that allow you to make those actionable steps later. Along those same lines, it's the intellectual part that we're always having to fight with. Am I overthinking this one thing in terms of making the balance for myself? And the kids are always like, how do you know when you're leaning away from God? And I think to myself, well, whatever God that is you pray to, are you sure that that's a leaning away from? Think in terms of what's the best thing that makes the most sense. They're like, I'm confused. I'm like, just hush up and write this quote down. I'm always giving them quotes. So I always end up quoting them at the end of the year. I'll give them the quote of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who is like the best feminist example that I can think of from old school writings. Inés wrote, how's the quote go? She said, I do not study so that I may know more. I study so that I can ignore less. And the idea that we have to be self-aware. For me, reading her work is always this idea of metacognition. How are you thinking about your thinking about how you're doing? And along those lines, if we can begin that for ourselves, then that becomes some kind of newfound way of relating to ourselves, our own spirituality, our own consternations about what theology looks like and what practice is. I believe as long as we can do well in the world to make and provide so that others can make and provide for themselves, and then others allow that echo to keep going, that's that action that speaks to our own self-identity.
That's good, that's really good.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question to the group. I had sort of prepared questions, but is it okay if I just, these remarks have been really thought-provoking and probably more aptly heart-provoking. And so one question that comes to mind is, how does spirituality show up in community forms? So all of you had in your narratives ideas about your own spiritual sensibility motivating common good and common action, and we think of those often as community practices. And so perhaps survey researchers like myself have stereotyped people who think of themselves as spiritual but not religious, or put that label on them as being individualistic, but perhaps such an individual introspection leads to more robust and moral community action. And so you're all working within communities, and so are there ways in which, especially thinking about the Rothko Chapel and what you're doing, what the Young Center is doing, are there ways in which you're forming robust spiritual community?
I think from a literary perspective, in the poetry spaces across the city, there's this moment of quiet before a speaker, a poet, a writer hits the mic. Mm-hmm. Right when everybody is hanging on the to-be word. I think that's that moment in which we all have this very almost clergy type of understanding of space. Like we're all there to share in the same love of literature, or the same love of craft, or the same love of poetry, that when somebody yells out, respect the mic, it isn't a call out to not be rude. This is a living body of writers and artists. Let's make sure that we give each other the space to be the writer and the artist. I think for me, in some form or way, that's one of those ways that it happens. It's that deep breath right before someone, it's the potential energy before something strikes.
Ashley, how about yourself with the Rockwood Chapel and what you're doing there? I mean, you have a space and a structure and people coming together. Is there a sense of communal spirituality?
I think so. I think what I was trying to think about, I feel like, when we use this word community, sometimes there's this idea of what community is, this definition of it. What comes up for me is a couple different things. I always go back to this amazing group, the Rockwood Chapel Field, which Barbara and Avro are part of. It's this group of volunteers, and that's what comes up for me. It's just this, there's this community of people who, many of whom I think represent many different religious and spiritual traditions, who are very committed to being thoughtful human beings and moving through the world in a respectful way. And I think because of just the safety of the chapel and what it represents, what I've noticed is just this magical group that have come together and connected. And it's kind of a combination of volunteers, staff, attendees. It's kind of this woven tapestry of a lot of different people. And I think the heart of it is just this like safety and respect, reverence, sacredness, like all of those words come to my mind. I don't know if that answers your question.
You don't all have to answer the question. You can. There's no, I say there's no pressure, and I'm like, hey, and that's not really what my body language is communicating, is it?
A couple of thoughts. One is that just to talk a little bit about a historical tension here at the Young Center, which is that, which gets at the word not in spiritual but not relatives, which is that we had what the Young Center is kind of famously an introverted place, and by that I mean people who are introverted, using this psychological language. This idea is that people who are introverted, when they're in large groups of people like this, it draws energy away from them, and then they have to go back to their solitude someplace and commune with Netflix or a book or a cat or something, and so many people who come to the youth center tend to be a little bit more introverted, and extroverts get their energy from being in groups like this. I tend to be more introverted. But there was a tension in the youth center for years around people, largely the extroverts in the room, like, we want to build community, we need community. And the way that they knew to do it was they would always come up again and again. You know what we need? We need greeters at the door when people come in to shake their hands and tell them, welcome, we'd love to see you. And that would always get vetoed in very primitive ways.
We're gonna read the heck out of them.
Because it felt like church. Like, this is the thing you would do at church, is that you'd have greeters at the door to make sure everybody felt welcome and come into our community. And so there was a lot of tension around that internally. And the place that we landed on in talking about it is that we can create a space in which community can emerge. And it does. And it emerges in quiet ways, in classes where there's a group of people that otherwise wouldn't have encountered each other that come together and are really vulnerable, because by the nature of a lot of these classes, you end up being encouraged to draw on your own experience and share it. And then relationships form in that context, and then little dinners happen afterwards, and people connect out in the world. I I don't know, in terms of I don't know if your question was more about how does social action then come out of that? 'Cause I think
Yeah,
it's-
I was kind of, Sean and I did a conversation for another group a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the ways in which spirituality might lead to common social action. There's maybe it's not quite right that spirituality is just about individual introspection, but there.
Yeah, and again, I come back to the metaphor of the breath, that there's a dynamic process here, so we're breathing in and we're breathing out. That so if we're going to spend time in an introspective process, reflecting on our lives, living an examined life, then that's going to be carried back out into the world. But it's a different model than a religious model. I can tell you a story from that night, actually, which is that I had a gentleman from what I believe is a fairly conservative Christian denomination in town. He was an assistant pastor. He came up to me after our remarks, and he looked at me a little bit. He wasn't unfriendly, but I could tell I was a little bit like an alien that he'd encountered, and he really wanted to get to know me and figure me out. And he asked me an interesting question, which is, he said, "Well, people come to church. How do people who are spiritual but not religious figure out how to vote?" He said, because people come to church to learn how to vote. And it was a little bit more sophisticated than that, but not quite, not too much more. My answer was, well, from a variety of different places, and I think people who attend classes at the Young Center are very engaged in a lot of different ways politically. Again, around towards your question of, okay, well, let's look at social activists and ask them where they're where their belief systems are, what motivates their social action. But what I didn't say was, well, actually, I stay connected politically, and I listen to podcasts and things. But when it comes to going to the voting booth, I take the GLBT caucus postcard that I got, and I go in there. Normally, that's one of my chief guides. So it's outside of the frame of a spiritual teacher or a spiritual tradition, guiding my specific political action. But the fact that I've spent time in this context, reflecting, sort of developing my own ways of thinking about what's important to me, what my values are, where I want to put my energy, then that gets communicated out into the world in certain ways. There's another way of answering that question, which I think the Rothko does very well, which is, and by way of a little plug, they've got an amazing conference on climate change coming up next week, just next week. Which is that you present an idea that you present an idea that has to do with the world outside of the world that's up here, and get people to think about it in these reflective ways and talk about it in these reflective ways, and then their action out of that is their action. The Young Center has a couple of where it's creating groups to go march and parades or things like that, but it is with an intention toward looking at not just at one's own experience, but at the world in an analytical way and in a reflective way.
That's good. That's really good. Each of you are doing such meaningful work, and I'm also sitting here wondering what the work you're doing might teach religious institutions and religious leaders. I interact a lot with those folks for the kind of research I do, and for Ashley and Sean in your narratives, there was also a kind of reflection on institutional religion, and I think it's right to maybe say the sins of institutional religion in some ways, right? It's a word deliberately chosen. And so, what could, now reflecting back, if we say that there's not a kind of, it doesn't have to be a division, you don't have to be spiritual but not religious, perhaps you might have more robust embedded spirituality that's learned outside the institution, but then could give back to it. What might some of the kind of reflection that you've done and speak back into it? Is that too complicated of a question?
For some reason, that was an easier one than the first one.
Okay, good. Phew.
But I don't know. I have an answer. It might not answer your question.
Yeah, no, I don't know what the answer is.
But what comes up for me is, in thinking about this conversation, I was just reflecting on, the and, like there's the religious And there's a handful of people that I've become close to within the chapel community, volunteers, attendees, who are very, have this, they were raised in a very traditional religious framework, and they're very loyal to that and still attend, their churches, etc. And there's just from what they're seeing in the world and how they're moving through the world, they feel that their religion is kind of too small of a box, and it's not really, the framework really isn't expansive enough to speak to what they're experiencing in the world. And so I think there's a large community of people who are religious and are supplementing their religion with other forms of spiritual practice. And I find that within the Rockville Chapel, and I'm sure you find that. And I don't know if that's what you're
That's
speaking
really
to.
interesting, yeah.
But what I think, even in going to some of the different interfaith communities and hearing older religious leaders talk about, the concern of losing the younger generation. I guess what just keeps coming up for me is these silos we create of this or that, and this kind of limitation, and I feel like some of it comes out of fear. We had this program last fall, totally different, but this is related, hang on with me for a second, that was, it was the Silk Road Ensemble. If you guys are familiar with Yo-Yo Ma and Silk Road Ensemble, and it was for International Day of Peace, and this is a group of international, well-trained musicians coming from all different types of traditions who come together, and then they bring all their traditional sounds, and then they meld together to create these new sounds. And there was this one tabla player from India who was talking about, I guess it was an opportunity for him to write a piece and then share it with the other musicians. And the problem was, though, that he, I guess in his tradition, it's not I don't know, music. There isn't a notation, or it's not written in the same way as, I guess, Western, whatever. And so, and there was a disease, for him, there was this concern of this melting or losing his traditional music by combining it with other forms of music. And so he tells this entire story, and in the end, what he found was it's the ands. He can hold on to this traditional music that he has, and respect this other music, and play both, and create something in between. And I kind of, for me, I
That's a great
think about, within religion, I think it's the same, that there is a conversation that can happen that can be more open, and nothing gets lost. It's actually, I think, we add layers, and there's opportunity there. Does that answer your question?
I think I dropped. I think history, sometimes we just need to look a little bit more sometimes to the things that we've already done. I am self-love. My first book of poems will be out in April. My second collection of work is actually a multi-genre book based on the history of Latino desegregation in schools here in Houston. So desegregation, as we know in Houston, which not lots of people are aware of, was slow going. The first schools did not desegregate completely as a whole district in HISD until 1970, 71. At the time, the district's only plan to desegregate was to bus kids between 12 schools, 12 quote-unquote white schools and 12 quote-unquote black schools. The 12 white schools were the most Mexican schools in the district. So no white kids were a part of the original desegregation plan of August 31st, 1970. It took about 2-3 years of fighting in the courts for Mexican families to make sure that a real, just deseg law passed. But in the interim, community and pastors of Lutheran churches, Baptist churches, Catholic churches, Presbyterian churches, opened their doors willingly when Mexican families chose to strike and did not allow over 3,000 students to attend HISD schools in protest. And they opened their doors and allowed whatever space they could hold for communities to create what at the time had not been coined charter schools, but were the first iterations of community-led schools run by retired teachers, student teachers, part-time teachers, elders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that ran school for these students for that little bit of time. I think that provided for this understanding, and still provides to this day, a blueprint of what, when push comes to shove, who can and will open doors and resource for those things. The research I'm doing includes interviews and figuring out the actual maps of where people were in terms of neighborhoods, the feeder patterns in which the schools, in connection between the elementaries to the middle schools to the high schools, which spaces provided different spaces for classrooms that weren't intended for classrooms. I have most recently done a few interviews where a few young ladies remembered going to school. One half of Holy Ghost Church was the middle school, the other half of the church was the high school, and they arranged a curtain across the middle, and then would have recess when it was time for mass. And just the adjustments of what people did, the Juan Marcos Huelga School that existed the entire duration of the Huelga School period was a Presbyterian church that had its own building and school that still had an extra 5 to 6 classrooms that were unoccupied, and an entire whole school was able to be produced out of just that. The ability for community to surround themselves around those institutions and then create their own food service kind of deals, their own carpooling systems around these spaces. The interconnectedness between bus shuttlings and families, even doing simple things but amazingly active things like creating fundraising events. In the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, there's the Huelga School file. I found what is this really awesome, well-drawn, stenciled flyer for a music night, which was $1 to get in. The pre-sale was 75 cents. $1 to get in. All the money went to the Huelga schools, but this was at Resurrection Church on that side of I-10. So you had different spaces doing completely different things, all servicing the same goal of equality in schooling. And the irony of it is, it was the private spaces, the private institutions, quote unquote, some of them are private schools that responded with wanting equity for our kids. And so maybe that's some of the response, like how does that turn into action?
That's good, that's good, and a common goal is to work together. Yeah, that's great, that's really great.
But that is but that's a religious institution.
Yeah, that's a religious institution.
So this turns back around to the notion that, like, one of the things that I hear that story is, well, if 27% of Americans are spiritual but not religious, and we're seeing this decline in church membership, we're also seeing a decline in the power of those kinds of institutions to affect that change, right? So it could maybe, I think, towards your question, which is, well, wait a minute, well, what do institutions look like? Where does that come? Where does that happen in the future? It's not happening. You know, the well-known schools of the future. Where do they emerge if the churches don't have the power that they used to have? Yeah, that they must have. And there are communities organized around it. And I think your question was about what could be said to congregations or what tools might be useful. And it got me caught in a little reverie around psychology and this sort of relationship between, the bumpy relationship between psychology and spirituality over the last 100 years, and particularly religion.
Yeah, that's good.
which is it was pretty openly antagonistic, and in some quarters still pretty antagonistic. It depends on, there are barriers to mental health, education, and even conversation that happen within religious congregations, and then within the clinical establishment, there's still a good deal of suspicion of religion and spirituality as being superstitious, or there's this phrase called spiritual bypass that has got a lot of currency lately, which is that when somebody is using a spiritual idea as a way of getting around experiencing something difficult, a particular developmental milestone that one needs for psychological growth and development, that one says, well, I'm going to just give it to God and God's going to take care of it, for instance, you know, and as opposed to dealing with the trauma, the suffering that comes with the trauma. So I think that there's a lot of tension there, and also ambiguity around what is the relationship between psychology and spirituality. You know, if the pivot point for these two is inner experience, that we're using both of these languages to talk about one's experience, then what is psychological and what is spiritual? And I have maybe a story. I don't know if this is illuminating or not, but I told somebody this story recently. So I went. The Young Center's found itself backing into social action in the past couple of years in ways that might point towards this. So one of them was during Hurricane Harvey. We ended up backing our way into doing coordinating mental health volunteers at the George R. Brown Convention Center. Another one has been that for the past couple of years we've been going to Haiti. We actually last year and this year are sponsoring a conference in Haiti in Port-au-Prince to train professionals and paraprofessionals there in basic mental health techniques, students at the University of Notre Dame in Port-au-Prince. I went there, the first year that I went and gave a paper there, it was packed, 350 people in the room. This is hosted by a Catholic university, but it's a mental health conference. And I gave a paper where I talked about psychospirituality. I talked about spirituality from a psychological perspective. I talked about William James, and I talked about Carl Jung. And so they have this psychologized understanding of spirituality. And immediately afterwards, the priest, who is the provost of the university, grabbed me and pulled me over. He says, I have to talk with you. And what he told me was fascinating, which was, he said, we need to get this paper in press. He had a book, the edited papers was going to go out, because I have been struggling with my superiors in the order that he was, the religious order he was in, about getting us into conversation with the voodoo leaders in the community. And we want to get these mental health tools out because, of course, the networks that are functional in Haiti it's not governmental networks, it's the religious communities, right? And then so the voodoo healing community and also all the different Christianities. And so he's like, I can't, because of the theological differences, right? The Catholic hierarchy understands voodoo to be whatever negative thing we want to say about an indigenous, tradition, and anyway, very problematic. And but if I use this idea of spirituality from a spiritual perspective, then that gives me cover to bring in the voodoo healers. This is the tent that's big enough for both of us to sit at the table, and my superiors will be okay with that. But it's this strange relationship between psychology and spirituality, and the gray zone in there, where psychology's authority in the culture makes it possible for us to articulate a spirituality that then would get the religious congregations to get a psychological tool out into the community. And there's a lot of blurriness in there. But that might be an example of where.
I don't know if this,
go ahead.
I don't know if this fits. I think we've spoken before on, currently right now in South Texas, there is a larger number of individuals who are falling much quicker, much faster into issues dealing with diabetes at a much quicker rate. And it's starting to match, or they found a correlation. I attended a National Association of Chicano Studies conference about 2 years ago where this came up, in which individuals suffering from diabetes are falling into it faster with
no access to medical care, but when you look at the number of people who are retiring in the valley and the number of hospitals, they should have it lickety split. And what's happening is that they were drawing a conclusion to the idea that the number of bienvenidas, so like homegrown curandera practices, cultural indigenous understandings of how to fix an ailments, were closing down, and what we're opening were 24-hour emergency care clinics. And people of color don't run off to 24-hour spaces. So what started to happen in the valley was that there was now a beginning conversation to be had between medical institutions reaching out to elders who were revenue, who had these established guerrillas, to build this bridge and build this connectivity, both having the conversation about spirituality as well as, what are those practices that medicine thought was hogwash, but are actually rooted in some real practical everyday applications, and how to bridge that gap. And it now has become this work in progress to combat what is now a corporate entity kind of a deal that's coming in to gentrify spaces of both elders and community, and also this other level that goes past the religious but into the spiritual understanding.
Should we take a couple of questions from the audience? Is there, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
can I just ask a fact question about your last point? The decline of the indigenous healers, is that just demographics, or is there anything institutional happening that's contributing to that?
So the decline of indigenous healers per the last point, is that demographic or anything institutional that's having us repeating for the video?
I think in spaces along the border, I can say in the lower, I can say in spaces like the Rio Grande Valley, unless those practices are kept alive from someone willing who is young to be willing to learn from an elder those practices, I think sometimes those things have the risk of dying out. I think there's a resurgence. I think that the level at which the numbers are showing that the number of individuals who are spiritual yet not religiously attached to something are the ones that are picking up that baton and carrying it forward. I think that risk is always present, especially now when we're talking in the age of medical gentrification, where you have spaces that were once community centers that are now these rapid care 24-hour spaces that are not actually affiliated with a hospital. I think some of those things warrant a look at to see what's happening. In other communities, I know that in spaces like New Orleans, some of those are some of the spaces that's also a concern as well. So those are, I guess, 21st century look-sees into what is the potential and what could die out. That's always been an issue with the indigenous populations. Who carries the legacy of both, not just only the stories of elders, but also its medicines and its traditions and its language.
Yeah, Dr. here?
I have observed that some of the spiritual dimensions of healing arts among indigenous people is very vulnerable to the sins of institutional religion.
So some of the healing arts among indigenous
Because
people
there's a spiritual
are vulnerable to
dimension
the,
to the indigenous healer's work, but it's not viewed as something positive by traditional or institutional religion.
so institutional religion wiping out or standing against indigenous healing work.
It creates walls or barriers rather than bridges in a lot of ways. I think that's where archetypal psychology has helped me. Just having done work with diabetes in Australia and having problems engaging the Aboriginal population, for instance, because some of their healing arts and some of their ancient wisdom doesn't bridge well with modern technology. And it's a pretty complex area. But I do see a connection between what the expression you used earlier about the sins of institutional religion, actually being judgmental about things that have worked for people in the past, that need to be brought in. And then it reminds me of your use of the music, because it's a kind of a synergetic experience where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There's a potential for that. But there's also potential for great hostility.
Other questions? Yeah.
If we think of spirituality and religiosity as intersecting circles on a Venn diagram, this tells me there must be some people out there, in my observation also, that are religious but not spiritual. I mean, that's a different seminar.
There are people who are religious but not spiritual. So, yeah, it's not a huge group of people. So, so both, I can't remember any of our our row of statisticians does not want to take a crack at it.
Who would
It's
claim that,
portion of
though?
people. Yeah, so there are people, I mean, so basically, on these surveys, you wanna like use surveys helpfully, right? And I think surveys can be very useful, but always remember that the researcher creates the categories, right? So here's how we set these things up. We might say, are you spiritual but not religious, spiritual and religious and not spiritual, neither, etc. And there is a small proportion of people who think of themselves as religious but not spiritual. Yeah, for sure. But most people who are religious also think of themselves as spiritual.
Are there historic individuals that, like, I don't know, like a flashcard, like, that's an example of religious but not spiritual?
Like totally outside of my area of research, but I'm imagining there are, yeah. And that's a good idea, that's an interesting idea.
And I would say that, again, to get back to these language games, like, it's, the idea of spiritual is very contemporary, right? You know?
And
Very-
perhaps Western, we didn't even go
Yeah,
down
very
that
Western,
road,
very
but
Western.
yeah, Michael?
Sorry, I was going to ask the same thing. If you knew of any examples of religious but not spiritual, because you kind of piqued my curiosity, and now I'm wondering.
Like people, like,
Just what would, so I guess if somebody identified as religious but not spiritual, what would go into that label?
no, we just create a box and ask you to check it. Like, I'm just, like, in all honesty, like, that's what happens, right, because Michael does surveys too, but, yeah, I mean, that would be a good study to do, to sort of think about why would you think of yourself as religious but not spiritual, as we think of, and I think Sean's brief historical dive, which was very helpful to not to situate this in present context. All of the ideas of spirituality are coming in part from historical religious traditions to some extent, but also in response to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is
Not an answer to your question.
what is the people that quote the Bible and do not believe in things like scientific? Wouldn't that be someone that was religious and not spiritual? Because
This is crazy. As survey research, we don't judge. So we don't, yeah, that's just all that we know is that they check that box. I don't know. You mean like quoting the Bible,
yes,
sort of believing in the Bible but not being accepting of science?
yes, yes. I think maybe that would have something to do with
Yeah, go ahead.
So maybe the religious but not spiritual people are the ones that go to church to learn how to vote.
Yes.
If I could comment really quickly, I had lunch with a couple of pastors from a local church yesterday, and we were talking about the difference between spiritual formation and moral education. And so I said, well, tell me a little bit about what spiritual formation looks like. And it was really fascinating from their perspective, and this is a mainline Protestant denomination. They said in their church, in their particular congregation, spiritual formation looks like people fulfilling the ritual roles within the service. So going through the sacramental processes in the correct way and being present. So there's communion served and making sure that the communion is served in a certain way, and that there's serving within the ritual processes of the church. That is spiritual formation within the context of that church. And we also had a conversation then about one of the ministers said, and if you talk to these people privately, one-on-one, they will, many of them will say that they've had extraordinary spiritual experience. He was very careful about how he used his words. I had to sort of push him to get him to use the word spiritual, but he would say they've had these experiences that they're concerned about talking about, and they have to build a relationship with the individual minister before they'll talk about it. So in that case, it's indistinguishable what spiritual formation is from religious practice in that congregation. I don't know that you could, I don't know how you would divide it up.
And speaking along that line, only because I've been working at a Jesuit school for 5 years, the idea behind how to build a morality is directly tied to the spiritual formation, which is self-reflective. You go through an entire practice of quiet, meditative prayer in order to find this unique response, which is different for every single participant. But you go through a series of reflective prayers as designed by, quote unquote, St. Ignatius. I've tried one step of it. I can't, I love it. I can sit there for like a half hour, and then I'm like, can we? But for each their own, right? And so in that undertaking, that it takes its time to do the process, and it repeats and can be repeated, and it's you do over as many times as you need to get the fulfillment that one is looking for.
Rachel.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment, because what I was thinking through this conversation about was when we think about like conservative religion, a lot of, for example, evangelicalism, that has really been defined, at least in the 20th century, by belief. But what I heard you all talking about is practice. And, what is return to practice, or do you think that there is more of a turn to practice among people who are spiritual but not religious, or maybe that even extends across different religious traditions and spiritualities, but is that another way that we can think about our connection and our spirituality that might be different than how people traditionally thought about it in the last 100 years?
I mean, I would I hopefully speak briefly about this, but I would say, again, the connection between the emergence of this language of spirituality and the emergence of the language of mysticism, and also the emergence of psychotherapy, that it all pivots on this notion of inner experience or personal experience. And so I really like that idea that there's this practice. It's about practice and also a subjective experience that one has while engaging in the practice. But that could expand to include, in this context, working with one's dreams, right? That could be understood as this practice that isn't tethered to a religious tradition of one sort or another.
This is where survey research is a little bit helpful in terms of looking at why some young people say they're leaving the institutional church. There is over and over across different survey studies the sense among younger people that there is a cynicism in institutional church because right belief does not lead to right practice, right? There's an inconsistency between belief and practice. And so that's maybe something, when I sort of try to merge together all these literatures as a scholar and then think like what we say that's helpful to institutional religion, maybe it is to think through more spaces where there is a consistency and at least at the individual level, a space for reflection on what consistency might mean. And, the Ignatian way is certainly an attempt at that, right? But I mean, it's as hard as it is to follow, but if there's some kind of sense like, well, let's get right in ourselves so that we can follow the way, right? So that's riffing.
Isn't one of the problems that we're having here is the lack of definition between what is religious and what is spiritual? because sometimes they're together, sometimes they're very far apart. In today's context, where the young people no longer feel any life in the rituals that were established 2,000 years ago, and they see these as simply a recitation of what my father said, his father said, and you can go all the way back. They don't feel any spiritual life. But there's still a spiritual nexus with something. And so they call themselves spiritual, but they don't want to hang on to all of these rituals that they think is garbage, because it doesn't sustain them. It doesn't form any connection with life. But they still feel that spiritual connection with something. They don't know what it is. And Young's, we're in a Young Center. He said we're in a position where we're no longer attendant to what happened in the past, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're kind of in a no man's land. And so everybody's journey is a spiritual journey, but it's an independent journey. Everybody has to find his own spirituality. And if you find it in a religion, good for you. But if you don't, you're on your own. And it seems to me that's where we are in the current situation. Everybody who has left the old religion behind because it doesn't sustain them is on his own journey to find what sustains him. And that's what the Young Center is all about. I wish all of you would come here to listen, not to Sean, who is a brilliant man, but to all of the speakers. Just recently, we had a 3-day, it was actually every week for 4 weeks, one day, the former gentleman who had Sean's job talked to us, and one of the most brilliant things he said that I remember is that if you have a religious person who goes into a hospital, whether he's a preacher, a priest, whatever, whose religion was established 2,000 years ago, it's very strange that he doesn't ask for medicine that was practiced 2,000 years ago to be practiced on him now. He uses the science, he wants the science that developed medicine to be medicated to him right now. I mean, there's such a conflict of understanding about how religion is a process of evolution, just like science is a process of evolution. But fundamentalists, for example, don't see that. They're ossified in what happened 2,000 years ago, and there's no communication with what has happened since then. So come to the Young Center.
I think that's one of those levels of, I think that's now what's the grapples with current day religions. All the issues that we mentioned before that are coming up in terms of dealing with several of the churches. Things that are coming out in the news daily. Like the other day I was floored and dropped the kitchen knife as I was chopping up fajitas to cook when they said that for 900 years it's been the practice of the Catholic Church that if a priest had a kid, the kid was not acknowledged by either the church and the priest could not acknowledge that kid as their kid. And I literally was like, wait, they've done, and I literally, a part of it was like,
Don't be floored, that's a thing.
and then another part of it was like, that's still happening in the 21st century. There are grown people who know who their daddy is a priest, but could never, like, how does that mess with somebody's head? And if you're young and see that, and you're like, is that a religion that I want to be a part of? Or do I then take off to this awesome church that's brand new, that might rent this space, or might rent that, because that's now a thing here in town is, I have a few friends that, and a few former students who attend churches that don't have one central space. They rent spaces in different parts of town, and you can be a parishioner, and you're helping set up stuff for service. And that is a fulfilling thing, that they're finding a home and a space to belong to, right? And I think that communal sensibility is part of that practice. And if it works for them, go ahead.
Yeah, we need to bring this conversation to a close, but this has been, that was great, that was really great. And I feel like this is sort of the beginning of a very large conversation, right? We've been brought a lot of great issues that we've thrown onto the map here. And I just am really grateful for this chance to get this conversation started. I hope it doesn't end here. There is also a form on your chair that the Young Center would like to fill out.
For all events that are fair continuing education and also are longer than an hour and a half, which this one is now, we have.
So it counts.
We evaluate them. If you could, please just take a moment to let us know what your experience was like tonight. We would love to hear about it.
This was a super crowd. Thank you so much.
What a great
Thank
night.
you.